The tavern was awash with blood. Cidra Rainforest saw splashes of crimson everywhere seeping from a gash in a man's forehead, staining the front of another's shirt, trickling from still another's mouth. Glancing down, she saw that there was even a spatter of blood on the hem of her early evening surplice robes. To Cidra, the delicate yellow gold fabric spun of the finest crystal moss was not just soiled but frighteningly scarred. She was surrounded by a scene she had never before experienced, never even been able to imagine, and she found herself incapable of coping with it. It wasn't just the sight of so much blood that held Cidra immobilized with shock. All around her the vicious fighting continued unabated, even though Cidra knew that by now the combatants must be experiencing unutterable pain. Yet they raged on. The violence of it horrified her. Grunts, obscene oaths, and desperate shouts filled the long, low tavern hall. One man had been knocked unconscious by a deftly swung tankard of Renaissance Ross ale, but no one paused to help him. Rather, everyone was participating in the free-for-all with an air of what Cidra could only describe as lusty enthusiasm. No one was lying in a fetal huddle, whimpering on the edge of insanity, as Cidra would have expected, as indeed she herself would be doing had she not been using every ounce of her disciplined training to control herself. The scene around her was incredible. It was, she thought, just as the novels had described it. A large, scarred, brutally strong hand clamped around Cidra's arm, shocking her out of her stupor. "Come on, lady, unless you want to explain your presence to the guards. Let's get out of here." In a daze, Cidra turned to the hard face of the man she had met only moments earlier, the man she had come to this rough tavern to find. Teague's severance hadn't been quite what she had expected, and Cidra had been trying to adjust to that fact. "The guards?" she asked, clinging to the look of strength she saw in the man's gray eyes. "Port Valentine's safeguards enjoy breaking up this kind of thing. Thrive on it, in fact. And they'll be here any minute. Let's get going. I think we can make it out through the back." Cidra didn't argue. The stunning violence going on around her had not only disrupted her ability to think coherently but also seemed to be playing havoc with her normally excellent sense of balance. When her escort yanked Cidra toward the door and out of the way of a falling mountain dressed in a miner's kirtle, she stumbled and fell to her knees. Teague Severance's hold on her arm was broken, and he was whisked away by two men in a fist fight who suddenly saw him as a preferable target, but Cidra barely noticed. The huge man who had just fallen lay beside her feet, blinking groggily as he rubbed a bleeding jaw. Instinctively Cidra turned to comfort him, murmuring words of hypnotic comfort. "Focus, my friend. Focus, focus. The pain is receding. See how it fades. Focus on it. The oblivo is being brought to you. Soon all will be serene. All will fade. All will fade. You must relax and let it flow away from you. Let it flow." Her soothing words ended abruptly as Cidra was hauled to her feet. Severance's scarred hand was once again clamped tightly around her arm. Part of her had a moment to wonder how he had come by the odd lacing of scars. "What in a renegade's hell do you think you're doing? Get up off the floor, woman. We've got to get out of here. The wolves are howling tonight, in case you hadn't noticed." Cidra's escort pulled her unceremoniously around a writhing mass of human beings and continued to forge a path toward the tavern's kitchen. "But that man was in such pain," she murmured, feeling more lost than ever. "Don't worry, he won't feel a thing until morning." A hulking figure rose in front of Cidra, all bloody grin and glazed eyes. It wore a ship suit not unlike Severance's, but the diagonally slung utility loop was of a cheap, functional synthetic, not fine rant-gone leather. Cidra noticed long before two hands that, to her startled gaze, resembled grappling hooks reached for her. "Don't run off, little lady. You and I can go somewhere peaceful for some special handling. How does that sound?" Before Cidra could sort through her list of appropriate responses to a question she had never before encountered, her impatient escort dealt with the grisly man before her. "Don't touch her, you renegade idiot. Are you so drunk that you can't tell she's from Clementia? What's more, she's a patron." "My patron." The glassy-eyed man blinked, frantically trying to focus his eyes. "I'm sorry, lady, I mean, Otana. Didn't mean nothin', rude. Had no idea what I was doing. No offense intended, I swear to saints. Cidra hurried to respond to the man's apology. She realized that he was under a misapprehension, thanks to her escort's comments. Do not concern yourself. All is serene. And you have inflicted no real pain. I am, but again she was not allowed to finish her sentence. With a dazed sense of surprise, she realized that the Hulk with the grappling hook hands wasn't listening to her at all. He had turned to Teague Severance and was apologizing to him. Sorry about that, Severance. Never meant to interfere between you and a patron. Just a little misunderstanding. Better get her out of here, though. She'll probably go crazy any second. I'm working the problem. Unfortunately, she's not exactly cooperating. Cidra felt a rush of emotion that was decidedly akin to annoyance. She responded to the accusation in a tone of voice that was neither properly modulated nor serene. I am trying to cooperate, Oten Severance. But circumstances are making it difficult. Just close your eyes and stop digging in your heels every time one of these wolves gets in your way. And with that, the man called Severance once again hauled Cidra toward the tavern's back door, once inside the relative safety of the small kitchen, which was protected by a makeshift barricade of hastily arranged food heaters and ale dispensers. Cidra and her escort found the tavern's owner and his employees sitting around a table, playing a game of free market. The stacks of gleaming sardite chips in the center of the table indicated the seriousness of the stakes involved. Several bottles of ale resided at the players' elbows. The balding proprietor glanced up with a frown as Cidra and her companion burst into the room. Now, look here, kitchen's off limits. You know that, the owner growled. We're not participating, Severance assured him, not bothering to slow down as he headed toward the rear door. Just looking for a way out. But by now the owner had noticed Cidra's appearance. Everything from the expensive comb of fire barrel in her carefully braided hair to the slippers embroidered with genuine emerald floss spoke of harmonic wealth and refinement. What do you think you're doing bringing her here? She looks like she's from Clementia. She is. Sweet Harmony, get her out of here. I'm trying, Severance said, his hand on the door latch. Saints know I'm trying. There seems to be some misunderstanding, Cidra began hurriedly as she glanced back at the scowling tavern proprietor. I'm from Clementia, but I'm not a harmonic. Forget it. We'll straighten everything out later. Severance had her outside on the gently glowing floor quartz pavement. Maintaining his grip on her arm, he broke into an easy, loping stride and forced Cidra to match his pace. In the distance, the arrogant shriek of a safeguard runner sliced through the balmy night air. Cidra was suddenly very grateful that she wouldn't have to endure the indignity of being questioned. Kyrene, her mentor, would have been shocked, to say nothing of her parents' reaction. The glowing bands of fluoroquartz supplied all the light they needed to follow the path easily in the warm darkness. The pavement was still wet from a recent rain, and drops of water, illuminated by the natural light of the fluoroquartz, glittered like jewels. Cidra wanted to stop and examine the prismatic effect. Such naturally occurring phenomena, so close to artifice in their beauty, were meant to be appreciated. But her escort clearly had no intention of slowing down, and Cidra felt it was an inauspicious moment to debate the issue. But as she raced along beside Teague Severance, she found herself instead savoring the rich assortment of fragrances that floated on the damp, balmy breeze. Clementia was a subtly perfumed delight, its odors carefully generated by exotic, hybrid flowers to complement the delicate noses of its inhabitants. But here in Port Valentine, Cidra's olfactory senses were bombarded by new sensations, causing her to alternately wrinkle her nose or inhale sharply. Here, Cidra had discovered the faint scent of the sea at low tide, complete with a hint of rotting vegetation, and the sour odor that could only be from some tavern's garbage bin mingling with the rich smell of the recent rain. She thought she detected a waft of fernweed smoke as Severance urged her past a dark doorway. Cidra wanted to stop and find out why anyone would actually smoke the dangerous substance when everyone knew how bad it was for the body, But Severance gave her no chance. 2 blocks later, Severance finally slowed to a brisk walk. Right, I think we're clear. The guards will be concentrating their attention on the ones inside the tavern. They won't be looking for a few who had the sense to leave. You okay? Cidra, her breath coming quickly even though she'd had no real trouble maintaining the pace of the last 2 blocks, nodded. Yes, of course. I'm fine. Thank you for inquiring. For Cidra, such polite inquiries had always been expressed in the formal, ceremonial form, but remembering where she was, she tried to use her companion's colloquial style. And you? Are you, okay? Sure. Let's get off the street. There's another tavern up ahead. One that's usually quieter. We can get something to eat. I haven't had dinner yet, have you? Well, no, Cidra said. It's only 2 hours past the evening change, and I eat at 3 past. Is that so? Me, I'm starved. Nothing like pulling patrons out of tavern brawls to work up a postman's appetite. He gave her a roguish smile that made her strangely uncomfortable. You can sip nectar or whatever it is you folks normally drink. Cidra contemplated the situation. Actually, I am rather hungry. Perhaps the unplanned exercise is responsible. Severance grinned down at her, his strong, white teeth gleaming, although the glow of the pavement lighting cast his fog-gray eyes into pools of shadow. The rest of his hard features complemented the carnivorous impression. Perhaps. Cidra watched as the quick, feral grin disappeared, and wondered how an expression normally intended to convey laughter and humor could be so totally devoid of either. She shivered mentally. No wonder they called them wolves, she thought fleetingly. As a point of general information, I'd like to inform you that we don't sip nectar in Clementia. Another illusion shattered. But Severance seemed philosophical about the matter as he led his patron into a different tavern. According to the illuminated sign over the entrance, this one was called the Valentine, presumably a name coined in honor of the surrounding sprawl of Lovelady's chief port town. A heart-shaped logo enclosed the words. Once inside, Cidra glanced around with interest. The room was gently lit with a glowing pink light and was much quieter and far more refined than the first tavern had been. Here a mixed crowd of diners and drinkers occupied booths and a dispenser bar that lined the back of the room. The atmosphere was warm and comfortable and reasonably clean. Humans, both wolves and harmonics, still preferred to be served by humans, and the dining room was not automated. I take it this meets with your approval? Severance was watching her expression as they stood in the doorway. Cidra flushed, sensing his sarcasm. This will be fine. All I need is a chance to discuss my business with you. Wait till I order my food. I prefer to talk business over a good steak. Severance pinned a nearby member of the Valentine's staff with a steady gaze that eventually got the woman's attention. She glanced at him and then at Cidra. As soon as she took in the sight of Cidra's formal clothing and quietly regal bearing, she moved forward in an apologetic rush. Sorry to keep you waiting, Otana. I have a very pleasant booth available across the room. It's out of the way. Quite peaceful. Cidra inclined her head in polite acknowledgement. You are very kind. A moment later she was seated. A waiter materialized out of nowhere, bowing a little awkwardly as he set out utensils. I have to admit that you've got your uses, Severance said as he slid into the booth across from Cidra. I don't usually get such good service. He glanced at the holotape menu card only briefly before coming to a quick decision. I'm going to order the Torla steak. Maybe with you here they'll make sure it's cooked the way I order it. What suits you? Frantically, Cidra scanned the menu, looking for an item that didn't contain meat. Finally, she spotted the holotape images of a familiar Lovelady tuber and something that appeared to be a pile of greens. Politely, she gave her order to the waiter, who was so interested in getting it right, she finally had to ask him to listen to Severance's demands. I want the steak. Large size. And I want it cooked on the grill, not in a heater, understand? And when it gets to the table, I want it rare. Bloody in the middle. Rare. Cidra hid her dismay behind a serene expression. Severance went on to order 2 mugs of expensive Renaissance rose ale before she could explain that she never drank it. Cidra knew that the distinctly dark and potent brew was distilled from the thorn of a flower that was lethal, and too much of the ale was also considered dangerous. She managed to maintain a look of contentment as the waiter bustled away, but once he was gone, she sighed, feeling like a fraud. Severance leaned back in the booth and stretching his booted feet out under the table. He had been sprawling with the same rangy casualness when she had first seen him. Conscious of her own gracefully correct posture, Cidra wondered if Severance ever really sat properly in a chair. The close-fitting gray ship suit pulled taut across his shoulders, emphasizing his broad, hard chest. The suit itself was a standard pilot's outfit, cut in a severe style with functional collar and cuffs that could be worn open for comfort or neatly clipped closed for a more formal look. Severance wore both open, the cuffs pushed up on his sinewy forearms. The trousers followed his long legs neatly and disappeared into the tops of his boots. Severance was built along lean, tight lines but had a sense of solid weight that strangely disturbed yet comforted Cidra. His black hair had recently received a short no-nonsense cut, and she guessed he'd had it trimmed as soon as he'd hit port after the long trip from Renaissance. In the soft light of the fluoroquartz lamp, Cidra could see that the rant-gone leather utility belt he wore had been hand-wrought with an eye for exquisite detail. She wondered whether Severance had carved the tough leather himself and then shook herself out of her reverie and considered his question. Yes, I am feeling a fraud. Everyone seems to be jumping to the conclusion that I'm a harmonic. Let 'em jump. It gets action, doesn't it? So it seems. Cidra studied him a moment. You knew right away I wasn't a harmonic, though, didn't you? He shrugged. I wasn't drunk when you approached me, and I had a chance to get a good look at your eyes before that brawl broke out. I'll admit that I haven't met many, but there's something about a saint's eyes, something different. Cidra nodded. I know. She paused. Harmonics hate that nickname, you know? Severance's quick, humorless grin flashed, then faded. Saints? Impossible. Harmonics are constitutionally incapable of hating anything, least of all something as unimportant as a nickname. You're right, of course. I should have said that they prefer not to be called saints. Then they shouldn't be so damned perfect, Severance told her blandly. He held up a hand as Cidra started to protest. All right, I withdraw the comment. I don't want to argue with you. Not if you're from Clementia, and not if you're serious about doing business. He paused then for a minute, a strange look coming into his eyes. You are from Clementia, aren't you? Not just an actress or something? I was born there, Cidra stated, and immediately regretted the show of pride. A true harmonic was above pride. My parents are harmonics, she finished more quietly. Severance eyed her with what could have been casual interest if not for the flicker of cold assessment in his gaze. An aptitude for the way is supposed to be hereditary. There are exceptions to most things, Oten Severance. I'm afraid I'm one. Obviously. If you weren't, you would have fainted when some drunk miner got blood on your fancy dress. Cidra cringed at the truth of his words. She had wanted to believe that she had remained relatively coherent because of her training, but had to admit now that even the most rigorous discipline wouldn't have protected a true harmonic from the violence she had seen. So, Severance continued, you're an exception, but you are from Clementia. And you want to do business. That is correct. Suits me. His glance shifted to the expensive fire barrel comb in her hair. You look like the kind who pays her postage, and I'm always looking for patrons. He broke off as the rich, dark Renaissance rose ale was placed in front of them. Taking a long, obviously satisfying swallow, he met Cidra's steady gaze over the rim of the mug. What is it you want delivered? Cidra cleared her throat. Myself. Severance put down his mug. You'll have to try it again. A little more slowly this time. I'm just a wolf, remember? I'm not intuitive or telepathic. I'm not even wildly good at guessing games. It's simple enough, Oten Severance. Teague. I beg your pardon? He made an impatient movement with his hand. My birth name is Teague. Severance is my chosen name. Use either one you like, but skip the formality. No one in my line of work uses Oten. Cidra nodded with grave politeness. You'll have to forgive me, Teague Severance. In my world, formality is everything. Severance's mouth twisted wryly. I know. I'm sure it works just great in Clementia. Out in the real universe, it tends to be a waste of time. Why don't you finish explaining your business before we get sidetracked by a philosophical discussion on the role of the formalities? A faint flicker of amusement touched Cidra's expression. Are you capable of being sidetracked by such an esoteric discussion? Sidetracked or bored? One of the two. I see. She drew a breath and went back to business. As I said, I wish to mail myself. He considered her intent face. To where? Wherever it is you happen to be going. I have no single destination in mind, although Renaissance is high on my list. Postmen are famous for their unorthodox schedules. According to what I have read about your profession, you'll go almost anywhere in the Stanza 9 system to pick up a package. Nor are you particular about where you deliver your cargo. As long as someone's willing to pay the postage, he reminded her. Severance leaned forward, planting his elbows on the table. Even the gentle light of the lamp could not soften the hard lines of his face. But we rarely carry passengers, except in emergencies. And we never take tourists. I know it's not common practice. Do you know why? I assume it has something to do with the fact that most postmen tend to be loners, Cidra ventured. Psychologically speaking, people in your profession are often temperamentally unsuited to close social contact. It has to do with the fact that the ships are small and every spare centimeter has to be used as profitably as possible. Compared to packages and mail, passengers aren't a paying proposition. For one thing, passengers tend to eat. That means extra food has to be put on board. Passengers tend to sleep. That requires bunk space. Passengers also tend to want to be entertained. That's a damned nuisance. Pound for pound, it's cheaper, more profitable, and infinitely less wearing to carry the mail. Go buy a ticket on one of the regular freighters if you want to tour the system. Patiently, Cidra shook her head. The freighters only go to the main port towns on Renaissance and QED. From there I would have to find transportation to the various outposts. From what I understand, that's an uncertain matter at best. It's also very expensive. And I don't have a great deal of credit to spend. I can't even afford extensive traveling here on Lovelady, let alone the other planets and their moons. Please don't be deceived by my appearance. Most of what I am wearing is a gift from my parents. Severance stared at her. Excuse me for being a little slow, but I seem to be missing something rather vital here. If you can't afford commercial travel, how in a renegade's hell did you expect to pay postage for the scenic route? Cidra smiled brilliantly as they reached the heart of her plan. Actually, I intended to hire on as a member of the crew. I want to work my passage, Teague Severance. Whatever he would have said in response to that was lost for the moment as the waiter appeared with the heated trays of food. A still smoking slab of meat was thrust in front of Severance, who eyed the crosshatch grill marks with satisfaction. Cidra studiously avoided looking at the meat as she examined her own plate of vegetables. The waiter hovered anxiously until she glanced up and realized why he was hanging around. It's lovely. Just what I wanted. Please thank the kitchen staff. The waiter beamed and disappeared without waiting to see how Teague Severance felt about the condition of his steak. Severance didn't mind, he was too busy slicing into the bloody heart of the meat. He was unaware that Cidra was swallowing uncomfortably as she tried to avert her eyes and struggled to control her stomach. Just right, he declared, chewing a chunk with the thoughtful concentration harmonics reserved for a glass of fine ether wine. Like I said, lady, you do have your uses. Do you know how hard it is to get a place like this to use the grill instead of the heater? Cidra didn't pay any attention. She was lost in her silent recitation of the chant that by harmonic custom preceded the evening meal, a ritual that was also helping to take her mind off the bleeding carcass across the table on Teague's plate. When she was finished, she hunted unobtrusively around the table for the proper vegetable-eating prongs. Failing to find them, she settled for the all-purpose bowled fork that was lying beside a sharp-edged blade near her plate. The sight of the knife gave her a start. The idea of a weapon at the table was unsettling. She was going to have to become familiar with the informal eating habits of wolves. Are you going to finish your ale? Severance asked. Cidra glanced at the mug she had left untouched and shook her head. The famous brew didn't look terribly appealing. I'll finish it for you, Severance said, reaching across the table to help himself to her mug. About my passage on board your ship, Severance, I want to make it clear that I am fully prepared to work. I am not proposing that you take me along as excess baggage. Lady, mail ships are made to be operated by one person. They don't require any extra crew. But I've heard that male pilots sometimes hire a crewmate, she protested. Surely there must be plenty of small tasks required on board. He stopped chewing long enough to give her a hard, steady look. The kind of crew situations you're talking about are generally called convenience contracts. I tried it once and it was a disaster. Why was that? He stifled a muttered oath and went back to sawing on his meat. Because the woman I contracted with nearly drove me crazy. She and I were at each other's throats by the time we reached Renaissance. I had to put her off ship at port, try again with enough credit to buy a commercial ticket back to Lovelady. I decided after that experience that a little loneliness was probably good for the soul and a hell of a lot cheaper than companionship. Cidra smiled gently. The one thing you would not have to fear is me going for your throat. I was raised in Clementia, remember? Uh-huh. And what's going to keep me from going for yours? Cidra blinked, unsure if he was teasing her. He didn't look as if he was, but how could she really tell? Whatever sense of humor Severance had, it seemed to be on the savage side. When I inquired into potential ship's masters, I was told you were considered a reasonably honest man. Somewhat rough around the edges and basically a loner, as are most male pilots, but generally honest. Insofar as it is possible for wolves to trust each other, your acquaintances appear to trust you, Severance. Among wolves, I understand, that is not a common occurrence. Severance drummed his fingers on the table. Any wolf dumb enough to completely trust another wolf deserves what he or she gets. Just the opposite of how things work in Clementia, Cidra's eyes softened. For obvious reasons. Lady, you don't know what you're getting into with this plan of yours. Talk about being a saint among wolves. Would you mind terribly calling me by my name? I would prefer it to lady. She kept her tone rigidly polite, far be it from me to annoy a near saint. What was your name? Cidra something? I didn't have time to catch it back in that tavern. Cidra Rainforest. Rainforest, he repeated, tasting the word. That's your chosen name? Yes. Have you ever seen a rainforest, Cidra? Severance asked, his tone unexpectedly gentle. A real rainforest? No. This is my first time away from Clementia. How did you come to choose the word as a name? Cidra wanted to point out that they were not here for purposes of casual conversation, but she was too fundamentally polite to say the censuring words. I read about rainforests on Renaissance when I was 15. There were holotapes and slips of them in the archives. They seemed so beautiful, so rich and full of life. Endless blooms and endless green. I suppose the forests were very much in my mind that year, and 15 is the age at which harmonics traditionally choose their names. I understand that among wolves the age of choice varies. You could say that. The truth is that we sometimes go through 2 or 3 names before settling on the right one. Occasionally, a wolf finds it very useful to select a new name quite frequently. When she just looked at him with a puzzled expression, Severance abandoned the subject. Never mind. Tell me what made you decide to go planet hopping. My reasons are personal, Severance. His eyebrows climbed. Is that so? She flushed a little at his tone. In Clementia, privacy is greatly respected, Cidra reminded him, another good reason to abandon your idea of bunking down on a mailboat. There's very little privacy available on one of those ships. I am prepared to accommodate myself. Oh, yeah? How far? I don't understand. Those convenience contracts we just talked about? Do you know just what that entails? I assume it implies a sharing of responsibilities and tasks. Sweet harmony, what an innocent. It means a sharing of bunks, Cidra. Convenience contracts are short-term sexual alliances. Contracted for purposes of sex and companionship. The 6-week run to QED can be very long and lonely, Otana Rainforest. Now do you understand? Her face grew very still as she contemplated his words. Then Cidra nodded thoughtfully. She should have realized that something like this was involved in the contractual situations she had heard about. Wolves were said to be prodigiously interested in sex. Yes, now I understand. Well, I would not be interested in that sort of arrangement. Somehow I didn't think you would. Is that the only type of contract you would be willing to extend? If you had been listening carefully, you would have heard me say that I'm not even interested in a convenience contract. I told you, I tried it once and it was a disaster. I'll stick to finding a little special handling in between mail hops. I'm grateful to you for getting this place to serve me a decent steak, Cidra, but I'm afraid we're not going to be able to do business together. Cidra tried to hide her disappointment behind her mask of serene acceptance. So it would seem. You must allow me to pay for your meal, Oten Severance. It is the least I can do under the circumstances. He looked vaguely irritated. Skip it. You said you were running on short credit, and I just had a fairly decent run from Renaissance. I'll get the tab. Oh, no, I could not allow you to do that, she protested, genuinely shocked. It was I who approached you and took up your valuable time. I was sitting in a tavern about to get drunk. You didn't waste any of my time. I can always get drunk. I can't always get my steaks cooked properly. He picked up his mug and downed another healthy swallow of the potent ale. So, what are you going to do now? Go back to Clementia? Cidra's eyes widened in astonishment. Of course not. You are only the first male pilot I have approached. There are half a dozen more here in Port Valentine at the moment, or so the port authorities told me. I will work my way through the list. Surely there must be someone interested in a working passenger. And if not, I will wait until other postmen or postwomen arrive. They come and go constantly from what I have been told. Severance regarded her coolly. I don't think that's such a good idea, Cidra. Some of her anxiety bubbled to the surface and emerged in a flash of hostility that took Cidra by surprise more than it did her companion. Still, it is my idea, is it not, Severance? You needn't concern yourself with it or with me. Isn't there someone in Clementia who might be concerned with your notions and where they're liable to take you? She put down the all-purpose fork she had been using and sat very straight in the booth. I am not a child, Severance. I reached the age of maturity 4 years ago and am fully responsible for my own actions. Just as you are. Far be it from me to give advice to someone reared among saints, Severance growled. Good luck, lady. Just watch out what kind of contract you end up signing. Don't forget to read the fine print. He got to his feet. If you've finished eating, I'll see you back to wherever you're staying. That won't be necessary. It is, unless you want a scene. He slipped a credit plate into the small slot embedded in the table. When the faint glow confirmed that the meal had been paid for, he removed the plate and reached for Cidra's arm. She hadn't argued, Severance thought later, after having dropped Cidra off at her hotel. But, then, harmonics rarely argued, except about philosophical or mathematical problems. He remembered how his brother Jude had always backed away from a disagreement, putting on the same mask of serene contentment he had seen on Cidra's face that evening. Emotional confrontations with other people were very uncomfortable for saints, Severance knew. Belatedly, he reminded himself that Cidra wasn't technically a harmonic. It was easy to forget. He could understand why others such as the restaurant personnel reacted to her as if she were indeed a full-fledged saint. There was something very serene and innately dignified about Cidra Rainforest. Perhaps it had to do with the way she wore her long, red-brown hair in that formal coronet of braids. Or it might have been the way the elegant yellow robes flowed around a body that was as slender, graceful, and proud as that of a dancer. The clothing worn by harmonics was naturally as dignified and graceful as those who wore and designed it. The women's high-collared gowns, with their long, wide-banded sleeves, fit closely to the waist and then flared in an elegant line from hips to ankles. The fabric was uniformly the fine, beautifully worked crystal moss. Cidra's gown was no exception. She was not a tall woman, but her robes provided an illusion of height. She was a young woman, probably about 8 years younger than himself, but her eyes held more refined intelligence than a man usually saw in a woman that age. Of course, Teague reminded himself, if she'd been raised in Clementia, her education would have been thorough and sophisticated. Severance grabbed a runner outside Cidra's hotel to take him to his ship, but his thoughts remained with the woman he had just left. The essentially gentle quality that usually characterized saints was a part of her, too, he mused. But in Cidra it came across differently. In true harmonics, Teague had always sensed a distant, controlled, broadly humanistic compassion. In Cidra he had seen something much more immediate, a more vivid and impulsive empathy. Severance remembered the way she had stopped to help the downed brawler in the first tavern and shook his head. It had been a long time since he'd enjoyed any special handling in the arms of a woman. Too long. Chances were that his imagination was interpreting Cidra's actions in the wrong way. He was probably just hungry for the kind of gentleness a man sometimes needed from a woman. And, for some reason, a part of him had gone ahead and decided that Cidra could give him what he needed. A picture of her soft, slender body lying under him, her gilded nails clutching his shoulders, snapped into Severance's head before he could stop it. For an instant he knew a sense of self-disgust. Surely he wasn't one of those perverts who were attracted to the cerebral and remote female harmonics. Such men were only drawn by the sick need to despoil something they could never understand or accept. No, Severance reassured himself. His brooding awareness of Cidra was reasonably normal. She was, after all, by her own admission, a wolf in harmonic clothing. And while he hadn't been around many harmonic women, he had met enough to know that they didn't project any real sense of sexuality. Cidra, on the other hand, had struck him as a very sensual creature, even though her air of serenity partially masked the raw vitality in her. He had the feeling she wasn't even aware of it herself. A saint among wolves. To a certain extent Cidra would be safe, because most people felt a certain instinctive protectiveness toward harmonics. But there were all too many exceptions to that rule. Severance could think of several offhand, many of whom were fellow male-run pilots. At least she'd had the sense to choose a hotel in a reasonably safe section of town. Mankind's penchant for building cities around ports had changed little during the course of human development, nor had the basic characteristics of those cities changed. There were still good and bad sections, safe and unsafe areas. Cidra Rainforest had been wandering through some of the less desirable streets of Port Valentine when she had found him earlier that evening. Severance tried to ignore the fact that she'd be back on those same streets tomorrow evening. Searching for a more helpful postman, she would probably find one. He reflected as he sprawled in the back of the runner and listened to the faint shushing sound of the vehicle's twin blades on the pavement. Some renegades such as Neville or Skates would lick his chops and produce a very neatly worded convenience contract before Cidra quite realized what was happening. She would be on her way to Renaissance, only to discover that her harmonic trappings weren't much protection from certain kinds of wolves. Severance shifted restlessly as the lights of the port facilities came into view. It wasn't any of his business, he told himself angrily. By all accounts, harmonics were quite intelligent. Someone from Clementia had the ability to make her own decisions. She certainly didn't need Severance's help. As the runner hissed to a halt, Teague paid the fare with his credit plate and climbed out. He stood on the glowing sidewalk, staring at the tapering, floodlit outline of his ship out on the field. Severance Pay was poised for an immediate liftoff, her stubby, swept-back wings seeming to strain at the inconvenience of being planet-bound. She was always ready to leave at a moment's notice. The competition for lucrative mail runs was stiff, and Severance had no intention of missing out on prime cargo simply because his ship wasn't ready to leave. Automatically, he removed one of two small remotes he carried on his utility loop and punched into Severance Pay's primary onboard computer. He queried for messages and read the response on the small screen of the remote. A couple of friends had hit port and left word that they could be reached at one of the nearby bars if Severance happened to feel like a game of free market. There was a fuel tab that the computer had already been authorized to pay. And there was a terse message from one of the local postal agents saying that he'd had a special request from a client. Severance knew what that meant. A patron had asked for him and his ship by name. With any luck, that meant an important run. He started for the bank of comphones that were housed in a nearby terminal. "Hey, Severance, you son of a renegade, where's the little saint?" Severance hesitated and then decided that he couldn't shake Skates by simply ignoring him. The other postman grinned and waved from the terminal doorway. "I took her back to her hotel." Severance made to step around the man who had obviously been doing the port strip taverns. "Heard she was looking for a contract." "Not the kind you mean." "I'm not particular," Skates assured him. His broken nose twisted at an odd angle when he leered. "I take it you're not going to give her a lift?" "No, you're missing a great opportunity, Severance." "Me, I could think of plenty of things to teach a little saint between here and QED." Severance didn't bother to respond as he started through the open terminal door. But as the clear diazite panels slid shut behind him, he glanced back and saw that Skates was grinning more widely than ever. In the up-from-under pavement lighting, his features seemed almost ludicrously demonic. Severance cursed his imagination again and turned away, even as he found a vacant comphone and punched in the postal agent's code. Severance knew what Skates was going to do. And as he listened to the agent tell him that there was a rush shipment of small but vital robot sensors that would pay twice the usual rates, Teague Severance was visualizing Skates offering Cidra a contract of convenience. Skates's convenience, Chapter 2. He shouldn't have tried to touch her. Cidra found herself shaking uncontrollably. Perhaps, she told herself, if the man who called himself Skates had only continued to wheedle or argue, nothing would have happened. But he had reached for her, and Cidra had seen the hot lust in his eyes. She had reacted instinctively because there had been no real time to think. All her life her body had been kept supple and strong with the ancient exercise. The training had begun before she could walk. Cidra couldn't remember a time when she didn't know the essentials of moonlight and mirrors. Intellectually she had known, too, that the flowing, deceptively simple movements were based on an ancient form of self-defense, records of which had arrived with the first families of Stanza 9 nearly 200 years ago. But no one she knew in Clementia had ever actually used it in self-defense. She was shocked by how her body had reacted to the first genuine threat it had ever known. One moment Skates had lunged for her, and the next he was lying half-conscious on the floor. The instant in between had been a shifting pattern that hadn't required any thought or preparation on Cidra's part. She had known the basics since she was a child. But she had never known herself capable of using them so effectively in this way. The hem of Cidra's black and silver sleeping surplice was still swirling around her ankles, and Skates had just hit the floor when the hotel room's communication panel announced another visitor. Cidra tore her stunned gaze from the man at her feet and stared at the softly lit door panel. Just then Skates stirred, groaning, and Cidra stepped quickly out of the way of his hand. The door panel hummed softly, demanding her attention. Because she could think of nothing else to do, Cidra went to the panel and switched on the screen. The fine tremors in her body seemed to grow worse when she saw who stood outside her door. "Severance," she whispered. On the small screen his hard, unforgiving features were etched in impatient, irritated lines, as if he didn't approve of either his surroundings or his business in the hotel. Indeed, he did look out of place in the elegant hall, his lean, dark figure a harsh contrast to the silvered carpet and the soft, waving patterns of soothing hues that decorated the walls. Behind him, the subtly concealed security monitors turned politely toward his profile and then moved on. "Not yet alarmed, Cidra? Let me inside. I want to talk to you. If you don't open the door, the hall monitors are going to start recording my actions, and then we'll have to explain everything to the front desk." When she didn't respond immediately, he went on more harshly. "Come on, lady, I haven't got all night. I'm in one renegade hell of a hurry. I've got to get my ship off the ground within the hour. Severance, you better go away." Cidra's voice sounded strange to her own ears. "Something's happened. I don't think you'll want to get involved." His eyes narrowed. "Cidra, let me in. Now." The soft crack of command in his words jolted her. She was unfamiliar with such an approach to the giving of instructions. Cidra found herself releasing the computerized locks on her door without even thinking. A moment later he was striding into the room, shutting the door behind him. His gaze slid quickly over her form, assessing the apparent lack of physical damage. Then he stared at Skates, who was still out of commission. Swearing softly, Severance knelt beside the other man, feeling for a throat pulse. "I knew it," Severance said. The words were full of morose resignation. "I knew he'd come here, and I knew you'd probably let him into your room without a second thought. Naive little fool. What did you do to him?" Cidra locked her hands in front of her. "When he came to the door, he said he would be willing to take me with him on his mail run. I let him in and we started to discuss the matter. Then he made it clear that he was only offering one of those convenience contracts you mentioned. When I declined and asked him to leave, he touched me. Tried to grab me." His eyes were strange, Severance. Almost wild. And his hand was damp. "I think he wanted to have sex with me." Severance shot her a sidelong glance. "Yeah, I'd say that was one way of putting it. He probably thought you'd be easy game. I guess you surprised him, though." There was no time to think. Cidra stopped as she heard the apology in her words. Then she went on with grave honesty, "But even if there had been time to analyze the matter, I believe I would have done the same thing." "What, exactly, did you do?" "It's called moonlight and mirrors. It's a kind of dance. An exercise, really. But it's based on a very old self-defense technique. My instructors always said I had a unique style of interpretation," she added lamely. "I can see what they meant." Cidra watched with a frown as Severance pulled a small object from his loop and held it to Skates' temple. He pressed the small touchpad on the end of the device, and the other man's body jerked once. Then Skates went ominously still, deeply disturbed by her victim's new appearance. Cidra touched Severance on the shoulder. "What have you done?" "Bought us a little time." He got to his feet, and then saw the horrified expression on her face. "Don't worry. He's not dead. I just finished what you started. He'll be out until morning, and by then we'll be long gone." "I don't understand." "I've changed my mind. I'm taking you with me." He began moving around the room, opening the door of the closet. "I know I'm going to regret it, but I can't seem to think of a way around having to take you along. Maybe I can dump you off in Clementia before I head out to Renaissance." "I am not going back to Clementia, Oten Severance. I can't go back. Not yet." He swung around, her travel pack in his hands. "We'll discuss it on the way to Lovelorn." He thrust the pack toward her. "Here, get your things together and let's get out of here." As long as Skates stays unconscious in your room, the privacy locks will protect us. Once he gets on his feet and wanders out into the hall, the security monitors will pick him up, and then the questions will start. I vote we leave him alone here to answer them. He's not likely to file any complaints against you. How could he explain that he got knocked unconscious by a lady from Clementia? His pride will be our best protection. Unfortunately, it won't protect us from his friends, who will be looking for blood. So get packed, now. Somehow it seemed easier to obey when he used that cold, hard tone. She was still trembling from the violence she had caused and had no desire to question Severance's decisiveness. Numbly she began to remove her formal robes from the closet and fold them in the proper manner. We haven't got time for you to practice the fine art of elegant garment folding. Here, I'll take care of the clothes. You get everything else together. Severance grabbed the liquid soft garments from her hand and began stuffing them into the travel pack. My books, she said, trying not to watch as he treated her lovely gowns as if they were dirty ship suits. I'll get my books. There's room in this pack for them, he told her. She glanced at him in surprise as she began pulling the beautifully bound volumes from the auto storage unit beside the bed. Oh, no, there couldn't possibly be enough room. I have a separate pack for them. I could get a couple hundred data slips in here, he assured her before glancing over and seeing what she was doing. Saints in hell! Those aren't slips. They're books. Real books. Of course. She touched one of the hand-worked covers reverently. No information storage system ever invented can compare aesthetically with a genuine book. They are such beautiful things. It was Severance's turn to look shocked. They must weigh as much as an Explorer Pro. What do you think Severance pay is, a cargo freighter? Leave them here. I just arranged for a crate of rose ale to be put on board. There isn't room for your damn books. Cidra clutched the volume she was holding to her breast. If the books stay behind, then I stay too. Severance lifted his eyes beseechingly. I knew I was going to regret this. The Renaissance sink swamps will freeze before I make a mistake like this again. All right, bring the damn books. But move, will you? I've got a hot run, and it's COD. What's that mean? Cidra asked, hastily placing the books in a travel pack. It means, Severance said as he locked the pack he had just finished stuffing with delicate clothing, that I don't get paid unless the shipment gets delivered on time. Credit on delivery. I don't intend to make the run to Renaissance for free, so let's get going. Here, you take the robes. They're a lot lighter. Let me have those damn books. Anything else? No, that's everything. She edged around Skates's prone body. You're sure he'll be all right? Unfortunately, yes. Now just act normal out in the hall, understand? Pretend you've changed your mind about staying here and have agreed to spend the night with me. You've paid for the room? Cidra nodded and then asked, It's true, isn't it? What's true? Severance closed the door and set the locks. Then he shouldered the travel pack and started down the hall, Cidra following close behind. Wolves think constantly about sex. It's what that man Scales wanted from me, and it is the excuse you think the hotel security system will accept for our unexpected departure. By now you ought to have learned for yourself that wolves aren't nearly as elevated in their thinking as your friends back home in Clementia. It's not a question of refined or elevated thinking, she responded seriously as he herded her out of the hotel lobby and onto the glowing sidewalk. It's a matter of the relative importance of the subject to an individual. Sex is obviously a great deal more important to wolves than to harmonics. Severance opened the panel of a waiting runner and stuffed Cidra and her packs inside. Then he slid in beside her and punched in their destination. When he was finished, he leaned back in his characteristic lounging fashion and folded his arms across his chest. Maybe if sex were a little more important to harmonics, they would be able to increase their birth rate. Everyone knows they don't produce enough children to keep up their population. If it weren't for the random occurrence of natural harmonics among the wolves, there probably wouldn't be enough saints to keep Clementia running. The system works fine the way it is, Cidra told him firmly. It's good to have the new blood constantly being introduced into the harmonic society. If everything is so great in Clementia, what are you doing here? She looked out the runner's diazite window, staring at the passing town, which had been founded according to a careful plan but had since grown into an eclectic and sprawling mix of architectural styles on meandering streets. The glow from the sidewalks illuminated everything from old squat buildings fashioned by the early colonists of enduring anthrastone to the newer, gleaming structures built of obsidianite. Both materials had proven plentiful and cheap once the colonists had discovered how to pull them from the heart of the eastern mountains. One adventurous designer had done an entire hotel in the ubiquitous flora quartz. It was quite garish and tacky to Cidra's eyes. But, then, much of the town was. The jumble of styles and materials was visually unsettling when Cidra mentally compared it to the beautiful proportions and harmonies that dominated Clementia's graceful, simple architecture. All this passed before Cidra's eyes fleetingly, as she gathered her spirits to answer Severance's question. Since he was helping her, she felt she owed him the truth. You don't understand, Severance, she finally said quietly. I can't go back to Clementia. Not as I am. I don't belong. Raising a skeptical eyebrow, he turned to her. A person either is or is not a natural harmonic, he pointed out gently. If you aren't one, there's no use fighting it, is there? Her head snapped around, and all the years of grim determination blazed for a moment in her vivid green eyes. I will find a way to be one of them, Teague Severance, if it takes me to the end of the stanza 9 star system and beyond. I will find the answer. It's out there. I know it is. I have traced the legend since childhood, and now, at last, I'm actually going after it. He looked at her blankly. Going after what? What legend? Cidra bit her lip and sank back into her corner of the seat. It's out there, Severance. The tool with which I can become a harmonic. The instrument that can fit my mind into the natural patterns and rhythms of everything I see or touch. Maybe it won't quite duplicate the way a harmonic's mind vibrates in tune with whatever it chooses to focus on, but I think it can imitate the telepathic element. I think it can help me bridge the gap that my lack of natural ability has always put between me and the world I was meant to join. Her hands tightened in her lap. I have almost all of it, Severance. I have me training, the rituals, the education. I have studied the Clinian laws and the rules of serenity as the most devout of students. All I lack is the ability to achieve communion with the others and that intuitive element that makes the harmonic mind so unique. But I'll get it. Or something almost as good. I swear I will. The silence in the runner seemed frozen as Severance regarded her top features. Finally he said, That's why you want to ship out with me? You're searching for a legend? She nodded once, sharply, wishing she had kept her mouth shut. A ghost legend. Ah, Cidra. There are a million ghost legends. All of them created by humans after they reached stanza 9 and found all that junk lying around on Lovelady and Renaissance. It's not junk. We're talking about the artifacts of a vanished civilization. And this legend is based on one of those artifacts. I found too many hints of it in the archives. The tool is out there somewhere, and I'm going to find it. She shook her head wonderingly. How can you call the artifacts junk? Severance's mouth curved wryly. I'm sure that when they originally encountered the ghost ruins, the first families were suitably startled. But that was a couple hundred years ago, and when everyone realized how common the leftover ghost garbage was, the novelty wore off. Even the harmonics who are archaeologists are interested in only the most unusual finds. They don't want to be bothered anymore with every little shard or carving that turns up. If stanza 9 ever attracts any tourists, we'll all make a fortune selling ghost junk, but until then, it's practically worthless. The legends are even more worthless. We invented them. Every company explorer who ever had a bad dream while camped out on Renaissance has a new so-called legend. and the miners on QED are just as bad. Hell, for that matter, there is still enough unexplored territory right here on Lovelady to breed tales. If you're chasing a legend, Cidra, you're chasing moonlight. Moonlight, she said, thinking of the dance patterns that had recently subdued skates, is something I have been taught how to chase. Severance groaned. I should have had the ship off the ground the minute I had the mail on board. I knew this was going to be a mistake. Then why did you change your mind and come after me? When I think of a sufficiently sound answer, you'll be the first to know. And with that, the runner that had been slowing as it neared the port terminal slid to a stop. A few minutes later, her pack of clothing in hand, Cidra followed Severance toward the small, streamlined mail ship. She watched as he punched codes into both a computer remote and the gadget he'd used on skates. Then he led her aboard. The interior lights came on as they stepped over the threshold. Cidra stood looking around at the compact, painfully limited cabin space and wondered for the first time if she had really given due consideration to the problems of living in such confined quarters with another human being, and a wolf at that. She was still worrying the question when the scruffy rug beneath her feet moved abruptly. Startled, Cidra glanced down in time to see the motley piece of rug silently display 3 rows of tiny needle teeth. "Watch out for Fred," Severance said as she backed hastily. "He hates being mistaken for a rug." "Fred?" She watched the creature move in an undulating motion toward the seat in front of the command console. "Fredelius is his full name. But I just call him Fred." "Who named him?" she asked. "My brother," Severance answered, his back to Cidra as he stowed away his pack. "Does your brother fly with you occasionally?" "Not anymore," he answered in a clipped tone. "He's dead." "Oh." It didn't take a harmonic's empathic abilities to realize that she had blundered onto a painfully raw topic. Automatically, Cidra sought to soothe the discomfort she had caused. "I'm sorry, Severance. I had no idea. It was thoughtless of me to ask after him. I seem to be causing a great deal of unpleasantness tonight." "Forget it." He busied himself with sealing the ship. "Stow your packs under my bunk for now. That's where I had the ale put, so you'll have to fiddle a bit to find room. We'll decide what to do with those damn books later. Right now I just want to get off the ground." "We're leaving for Renaissance?" "First we're hopping over to Lovelorn. I got word of another good shipment. Then we'll off-planet for Renaissance. Once we're in space we'll have 2 solid weeks to drive each other crazy. If we reach Renaissance without having murdered each other, we'll talk about extending the contract." Cidra decided that this wasn't the time to argue her intention to stay aboard. It also didn't appear to be a good time to discuss the exact nature of the contract she had apparently entered into. She finished shoving her travel packs under the safety net beneath Severance's bunk. It wasn't easy. The crate of Renaissance rose ale took up a great deal of room. Cidra wondered if Severance intended to drink all of it before reaching Renaissance. The thought was unsettling. Then she took the single passenger seat located behind and to the left of the pilot's seat. Fascinated, she watched Severance run fluidly through the pre-liftoff procedures. It seemed to her that the computer had barely signaled that permission had been received to take Severance Pay into the air before they were, indeed, off the ground. The lights of Port Valentine hung beneath them for a moment and then receded into the distance as Severance set a course that would take the ship to the mountain town of Lovelorn. Cidra knew that within the confines of the planet's atmospheric envelope Severance Pay was powered by standard jet engines. Only when the ship thrust into the freedom of space could they safely switch to the distance-crunching power of the stator drive. Cidra studied Severance covertly. She admitted to herself now that he had been occupying her thoughts since the moment she had met him. It was all business as he worked, his intent expression illuminated by the glow of the console lights. She was aware of being strangely fascinated by him in a way that was new to her, and the knowledge was disquieting. She should be viewing him simply as a man with whom she was doing business, but Cidra was honest enough and uneasy enough to admit that her reaction to him right from the start was far more jumbled and complex than such a simple arrangement warranted. When he had first been pointed out in the tavern, she had experienced serious doubts about approaching him. It was obvious from the start that he was a hard man, a true wolf. There was an aggressive harshness about him that made it clear he was a man who had not been softened or refined by too much contact with harmonic values or ways. But she also sensed a quietly brooding element deep within Severance and wondered what had happened in his past to cause it. Something told Cidra it would be instinctive in Severance to avoid those ritualized behavior patterns and codes of conduct favored by people who tried to emulate harmonics. He would have his own way of doing things, his own code of ethics and standards. And he would stick to it. The people whom she had questioned at Port Valentine had been in agreement about one thing when it came to Teague Severance: he was a man of his word, and among wolves that meant something. It had to mean something. It was all the general population had when it came to ensuring trust. Wolves were forced to depend upon such things as reputation and experience to judge their acquaintances. They could never be completely certain of each other. They were forever denied the unique telepathic communion of minds that allowed harmonics to establish such firm bonds between themselves. Trust was implicit in the way harmonics lived and communicated. It was an unavoidable given, because they could know each other's minds. But when trust existed absolutely between a man and a woman, and was combined with the indefinable chemistry of shared pleasures and intellectual interests, it could lead to a lifelong commitment that was unique among mankind. Cidra's parents shared that type of commitment. Talina Peastry and Gam Oquist had a bond between them that Cidra had always longed to experience, herself, with the right man. Knowing that was impossible as long as she lacked true harmonic telepathy had been the misery of her life. And her determination to overcome her own shortcomings was the driving force of her existence. The covenant of marriage had taken on new meanings as harmonic society had evolved. It stood now, as so many harmonic ways did, as an ideal. Wolves frequently used portions of the formal harmonic wedding ceremony for their own nuptials. Harmonics had always appeared at random in the human population. For countless generations, many had died young. Others were driven insane by their instinctive efforts to reconcile reality with the inner harmony they saw in the world around them. A few had lived lives that appeared normal to others who never guessed at the effort it took to survive as a harmonic among wolves. Special aptitudes and genius were common among harmonics, and a few of the early ones had been strong enough to achieve a great deal before they died. Usually the achievements came in spite of a life racked with trauma and mental strife. Many others had simply perished without ever flowering. The world of wolves was a harsh one, and true harmonics seldom coped well. A few hundred years ago, just prior to the unprecedented outpouring of mankind into the galaxy, it had been recognized that both harmonics and wolves fared better if they lived a separated, if symbiotic, existence. When the first of the beautiful, interstellar shimmer ships had left the home star system carrying colonists to new worlds, they had carried small contingents of harmonics aboard. And one had been egocentric enough to believe that the galaxy could be colonized into a tightly knit empire. Distances were too vast, and the demands of different worlds required too much physical and emotional adaptation, and the streak of independence in human nature was too strong. But the early planners had felt the need to ensure that the best of what was human went with the colonists. Sending a small group of harmonics along with each colony ship had not only guaranteed philosophical continuity, it had also provided a resident brain trust for each new world. But, beyond that, each world had proved unique. Cidra knew from her work in the archives that the Stanza 9 social structure was different in sometimes subtle, sometimes elaborate, ways from that of the home worlds. And since the ability to maintain contact with the home planets had been lost, the distinctions between Stanza 9 and other human systems no longer seemed to matter. Adaptation meant survival. And both harmonics and wolves believed in survival. The crash of the colony ship that first reached the Stanza 9 system had been a complete disaster. Not only did the home planets believe there had been no survivors, but the first families, thus isolated, had been deprived of much of the technology that should have been their heritage. The need to dig in and establish a foothold on a new planet without the aid of the machines that would have made the task relatively simple had bred a rugged sense of independence in the colonists. That sense of independence had even permeated the harmonic contingent of the culture, where it was quietly accepted that each individual had both the privilege and the responsibility of achieving success on his own. Technology had developed erratically from the bits and pieces of information left in the heavily damaged databanks after the crash of the colony ship. Regaining spaceflight had been of paramount importance because the human population was intent on establishing itself throughout the Stanza 9 system. After finding the remains of the ghosts, it had become even more important to determine if humans were going to have to share Stanza 9 with anyone or anything else. It had taken 150 Lovelady years to get back into space, and the secret of the faster-than-light speeds that had brought the colonists to Lovelady had still not been found. The majority of the population, the wolves, respected the levels to which the harmonics raised human virtues because the seed of those virtues lay in all humans. When a wolf viewed a harmonic, he saw the best of himself, he saw the most valuable essence of his own nature developed and channeled. Intelligence, integrity, honesty, serenity, and an appreciation for every element of the universe were traits to be protected and respected. Every human knew this. Not every human reacted in a positive manner to the knowledge, but none could avoid it. Cidra drew the first deep breath she'd allowed herself since the man called Skates had lied his way into her hotel room. She was tired, but the adrenaline was still flowing through her system. Through the cabin window she could see the white disk of Lovelady's single moon, Gigolo. That small, dead world was also shining on Lovelady's southern town of Clementia. Her home was a serene, protected landscape of beauty and order. There lay everything she understood and loved. For a moment her heart yearned for another glimpse of the delicate fountains and the formal gardens that lined the white stone paths. But she had never been truly a citizen of Clementia. The magic of it had been denied her, even though she had been raised in its midst and taught its ways. Her own shortcomings had been pointed out quite graphically this evening. Severance finished one last procedure at the command console and then swung around in his seat to face her. "You look exhausted. Maybe you'd better grab a nap before we reach Lovelorn." "I couldn't possibly sleep." "Still seeing Skates coming at you?" he asked gruffly. "Don't worry. You're safe now. It's not that." She glanced out into the darkness and then back at Severance. "Do you realize that tonight was the first time in my life I've done violence to another human being?"